Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to those of you in St. Louis, in Atlanta, and in Israel to this important discussion about the events that are going on in the Middle East. My name is Brian Hersteg, and I'm the president and CEO of the St. Louis Jewish Federation. Thank you for joining us. Just want to make everyone aware that this program is being recorded. As you all know, we find ourselves in a rapidly unfolding situation. In fact, since we started planning this very webinar last week, a ceasefire has been put into place, which we all hope will hold. We decided to do this so that members of our community could have a place to learn and discuss the context of what has happened over the last few weeks. It's been difficult to know how to give that same kind of context and speak with our children, our families, coworkers, and acquaintances. Let's be clear, this is a very complex, difficult, and emotional issue with no easy answers. But hopefully, starting today a little bit, we can help clarify and give you some historical framework and facts. The Jewish Federation of St. Louis is proud to stand with Israel, especially during these difficult times. We support the people of Israel and feel for everyone affected by the unfortunate outbreak of hostilities in the region. In our role of FCC, that of a funder, a communicator, and a convener, Federation helps in so many ways. As a funder, the F of our FCC, we sustain the important work of our partners in Israel. During these last weeks, it was crucial to have organizations working on the ground. Partners like the Israel Trauma Coalition, the Jewish Agency for Israel, the Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, Hand in Hand, and the Israel Action Network, and so many others provided support. Many of them also ensured that aid and comfort were there for the peoples affected by the violence. As a communicator, our first C of FCC, we keep the community informed with regular updates to our Emergencies Around the World page on our website. And as a convener, our third C, or second C, third letter, we bring together the community to have important discussions like this one. One of our many efforts in Israel has been the longstanding Partnership Together program in Yokneam and Megiddo, an affiliation that we share with the Jewish Federation of Greater Atlanta. And we are very pleased today to be joined by Eric Robbins, President and CEO of the Jewish Federation of Greater Atlanta. Welcome, Eric.
Thank you, Brian. Wonderful to be in partnership with St. Louis. This is a partnership we really value. And here we are in Atlanta sharing in the same challenges that the rest of the Jewish world is. This has been a horrendous period for us. I'm from Pittsburgh, and the Pittsburgh massacre, which was so challenging for all of us, this was right up there with it. And I know many of our community are joining. And you know, we work so hard at building partnership, and we've developed such close relationships with our region together. So we're experiencing this loss with them. I mean, Eliad, who runs the region for us, tells us his stories of living in the city of Akko, where he lives. And that's a city where Jews and Arabs, Arab Israelis have lived in together. And now he is, experiencing the conflict between them, and the fact that he can't even wear his kippah in the community. It's just heartbreaking. And then to have lost Oded Tabib, who was a soldier from Megiddo through this war, has just been really, really, really challenging. I will tell you what we're doing today is exactly what we need to be doing. And I think Michael is the exact right person to lead in this discussion, and Brian interviewing him, because there is so much misinformation out there. And I worry most about our young people. I'm sure like many of you, like me, many of you have seen the Pew Report. The younger you go, the less understanding you actually do, and the less commitment you have to understanding and being connected to Israel. And that's disturbing. And I don't believe that many of them really understand the facts. And I don't believe we should tell them how to think. I think we should just give them history, help them understand all of this, and let them come to their own thoughts on it. And I think that their own thoughts would be like ours. They would stand with Israel on this. But it's really, really challenging. And I think if there's ever a priority that's going to grow out of this, it's going to be Israel education. So hopefully this is the start of doing more of that. And thank you for including us here in Atlanta, and may the ceasefire be the beginning of a longer lasting peace. And Michael, thank you again for being here.
Thank you, Eric. And thank you for your partnership. So as Eric mentioned, this afternoon, we are fortunate to have with us Michael Kopolow, Policy Director of Israel Policy Forum. He writes the forum's Kopolow column and edits the Israel Policy Exchange. We know of no one better suited to explain the origins of this conflict and recent developments in the Middle East and help us all understand a little better how to have critical conversations with our family, friends, and neighbors about this situation. Michael, thank you for being here with us today.
Thanks so much, Brian. Happy to be here.
Well, we're very glad to have you. I guess, I can start in on a series of questions, but is there anything that we did not rehearse this. Is there anything that you'd like to start off with, either about yourself or about what you're seeing and feeling right now, or do you want to just jump into it?
I would just say, in terms of nothing about myself, but in terms of what we're seeing and feeling right now, as both of you noted, it's good that there is a ceasefire. It's been in place now since Thursday. By all accounts, it seems to be holding. And I think that, a lot of times when there is a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, it goes in fits and starts. This one actually seems like it stuck the first time, and I don't think that that's going to change. So we should all be grateful for that. The other thing I'd say is that while the fighting was going on between Israel and Hamas, there was also fighting in Israeli cities between Israeli Jews and Israeli Arabs. That also seems to have come to an end. And so, while we're obviously going to touch on lots of serious and troubling things during this conversation, I do think that there are, 2 points for optimism that we've seen just over the past few days.
That's great. Let's actually start. Why don't we zoom out a little, and maybe what you can do is give us a little bit of perspective. I'm gonna make it really broad, and you'll be able to narrow it down. But how did we get here?
Okay, so there's a backdrop to the fighting that broke out between Israel and Hamas on May 10th, and it requires understanding two separate things. One is what was going on between Israel and Palestinians in East Jerusalem. And the second is understanding what was going on within the Palestinian arena and Palestinian politics. So on the first one, there were really two sets of tensions in East Jerusalem leading up to the beginning of rockets on May 10th. The first was the pending evictions of Palestinians in the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah, which is in East Jerusalem. Sheikh Jarrah is very complicated, so I'm going to spend a couple of minutes on it so that people understand precisely why it's so complicated. Sheikh Jarrah is a neighborhood that dates back to the 19th century. It was a mixed neighborhood. It was then, and still remains, a neighborhood for relatively wealthy Palestinian elites. And it's also a neighborhood that contains the tomb of Shimon HaTzadik, a Second Temple high priest, which is why many Israelis refer to it as Shimon HaTzadik. Palestinians refer to it as Sheikh Jarrah. Before 1948, as I said, this was a mixed neighborhood. And when Jordan conquered East Jerusalem in 1948, Jews who owned property and lived in Sheikh Jarrah fled into Israel. And in 1960, and their properties were taken over by the Jordanian custodian of enemy property. In the 1950s, there was a deal between Jordan and UNRWA, the UN organization for Palestinian refugees, where some Palestinian refugees would move into buildings in Sheikh Jarrah. They would pay rent for 3 years. After 3 years, they would get title to those properties from the government of Jordan. And in return, they would give up any compensation and any rights they had as refugees. After 3 years, for whatever reason, title was not actually transferred. And so when Israel conquered East Jerusalem in 1967 and unified the two parts of the city, these properties were still held officially by the Jordanian custodian of enemy property. In 1968, the Knesset passed a law saying that anybody who had owned property in East Jerusalem before 1948, if that property was still held by the Jordanian custodian of enemy property. The previous owners could, if they had proof of ownership, could recover ownership of those properties. And there were two land trusts, Jewish land trusts, that had owned these properties in Sheikh Jarrah. They asserted their ownership. And then there was a deal between these two land trusts and the Palestinians who were living in the buildings that the Palestinians would pay rent and Israeli ownership of these properties would be recognized. So that's the backdrop to everything that's been going on. Now, the Palestinians living in these properties, they dispute Israeli ownership of them, and they have not been paying rent. And so the eviction proceedings were about whether the Israeli owners of these properties can evict the Palestinians who've been living there since the 1950s for failure to pay rent. And this is not new. There have been weekly protests in Sheikh Jarrah on Fridays, dating back years, I think over a decade. But because the Israeli Supreme Court had a hearing scheduled on these evictions for May 10th, which was also Yom Yerushalayim, Jerusalem Day, the tension on this was really increasing. And in the lead up to May 10th, we saw lots of focus on this from the international community. You had members of Congress who had been issuing statements or tweets about it. So, this is not, as I said, a new issue, but there was a lot more focus on it in the lead up. And the last thing I'll say about Sheikh Jarrah is, there is a claim out there that it's simply a dispute between two private parties, that it's nothing more than a contract dispute. In some ways that is accurate, because it is at the heart of it a question about whether the Palestinian families living in these properties have paid their rent or not, and if they have not, whether they can be evicted. On the other hand, this entire situation is only enabled by the 1968 law, which is, of course, a law passed by the Knesset, a national law. And while that law did not distinguish between Jews and Arabs, it's a neutral law on its face, because it is a law that only applies to people who own property in East Jerusalem. That effectively means that it is only Jews who are in the situation of looking to recover property. So I'll leave it to people to decide, how they think the best frame is for this, but that's the situation. Next, there have been lots of tensions in East Jerusalem during Ramadan over access to the Old City and the Temple Mount. One of the big points of tension was around Damascus Gate, which there's steps. If anybody's been there, there are steps around Damascus Gate that sort of make it look like an amphitheater, and in a lot of ways that serves as the Palestinian public square in East Jerusalem. And around Ramadan, there's a big tradition of after the iftar meal, when Muslims break their fast, going to those steps and hanging out until all hours of the night. In the past, the steps have been open. This year during Ramadan, the Israeli police decided to restrict access to the steps around Damascus Gate, and that caused tension with Palestinians. And then there were also tensions on the Temple Mount itself, where there was an episode with the Israeli police cutting the power to loudspeakers during the call to prayer so that it wouldn't interfere with President Rivlin's speech at the Western Wall on Yom HaZikaron, on Memorial Day. In general, there's always tension around Ramadan. This year, Ramadan fell out around Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaAtzmaut and Yom Yerushalayim, and so that made things a lot more difficult. And then around May 7th, May 8th, there was some stone throwing from Palestinians on the Temple Mount toward the Israeli police, and the Israeli police responded with tear gas canisters and rubber bullets, and there were scenes of tear gas canisters that were in Al-Aqsa Mosque, which also kind of ramped up the tensions even further. So as it was, East Jerusalem was pretty tense leading up to May 10th. The second variable is Palestinian politics, where at the moment, Fatah, which is the largest party that makes up the PLO, that is headed by President Mahmoud Abbas, is probably weaker than it's been since Abbas took power in 2005. There are a lot of reasons for this. If I had an extra hour, I could do a webinar on this alone. But for the sake of brevity, Fatah the Palestinian Authority had called for Palestinian legislative elections, the first ones in 15 years. They were scheduled to be held on May 22nd. and they were postponed largely because of Fatah weakness. Fatah itself had fractured into 3 different lists ahead of the Palestinian legislative elections. And so as a result of Fatah fracturing, which was a sign of weakness on its own, Abbas indefinitely postponed the elections. And that led to even more anger because elections were very popular among Palestinians. They're always popular among Palestinians. You can imagine how much more popular they are after not having an election in 15 years. And Palestinians actually believed that they would happen. Normally, Palestinians are pretty cynical about this, but Palestinians actually thought they were going to happen this time. And so effectively canceling them really brought a lot of criticism of Abbas, even more so. And so Hamas looked at this and they saw Fatah weaker, Hamas's main Palestinian rival, weaker than it's been in over a decade. And they saw that Palestinians were very upset about events in Jerusalem. And Hamas really looked at this as an opportunity to assert its kind of credentials about being the Palestinian party that is willing to stand up for Jerusalem, which is the most unifying factor in Palestinian politics, just as it is for Jews. Jerusalem is both a religious symbol and a political symbol for Palestinians. And it also thought that if it did this, it might even have a chance of sparking an uprising in the West Bank that would lead to Fatah being overthrown, which is really what Hamas is looking to all the time. And so all of that led up to May 10th, where Hamas issued an ultimatum to Israel. It said, if you do not evacuate all police from the Temple Mount, and if you do not eliminate what it said was Israeli settlers from Sheikh Jarrah, then we are going to defend Jerusalem. And of course, this is not what Hamas actually was looking for. It just used this as a convenient excuse. And of course, Israel was not going to abide by either of these. And so Hamas started off on May 10th by launching 7 rockets at Jerusalem, which is itself very unusual in terms of Hamas rocket fire toward Israel. And that's what led to the events of the next 10 days.
Thank you, Michael. It's my understanding that there were some things that preceded May 10th, and the month before there were some other incursions into Israeli land, whether incendiary devices, those kinds of things. So, is it fair to say that even though the focus has been on the May period, that hostilities had ramped up a little before then?
Yeah, there had been a resumption of balloons from Gaza, which we hadn't seen in really about a year. And there had been some activity along the border fence as well. So while all this stuff was going on in East Jerusalem, there were already kind of efforts to inflame things a bit on the border with Gaza. But it wasn't terribly unusual in the context of what we've seen over the past few years. When rocket fire started, particularly Jerusalem, that was really looked at as a serious escalation.
Okay. So we've talked for a couple of minutes about the territories for a second. Let's switch to the other side of this, which you referenced, which is that one of the most troubling developments during this conflict has been the rioting and violence we've seen in regions known for peaceful coexistence between Arabs and Jews. Why do you think we're seeing this violence, and why now?
So in some ways that's related to the same things that Hamas was looking at, and in some ways it's not. Now to start, it's important to note that almost all the violence, whether it was on the Arab side or on the Jewish side in Israeli cities, was carried out by young men, in their late teens or 20s. And so, this is something that we see all over the world, right? Not particular to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or to Israeli society. In general, this is the demographic that tends to be most easily inflamed about anything. But to look at more specifically what was going on, there's no question that on the Israeli-Arab side, tensions over Jerusalem were contributing to this, but that's not the only factor. Within the context of Israeli-Arab society, there have been a number of things over the past few years that have been building, and in some ways causing positive change, and in some ways, led to violence. One of the things that's been happening writ large is that Israeli Arabs have, over the past 10 years, but even more so accelerated over the past 5 years, started to develop a much stronger Israeli-Arab identity. And I'm always careful when I talk about Israeli Arabs about the terms that I use, because some people refer to them as Israeli Arabs, some people refer to them as Palestinian citizens of Israel, some people refer to them simply as Palestinians. And the reason I use the term Israeli Arabs, which is not a term that I always use, is because over the past few years, what we see is Israeli Arabs actually embracing their own identity as Israeli Arabs. And you now have a plurality, and in some polling, a majority of Israeli Arabs who use the term Israeli Arab in much greater numbers than those who self-describe as Palestinian or who self-describe only as Arab. And that's important because what you see is this group embracing their Arab identity, but in a very distinct Israeli way. And the same way that Israeli Jews have their own Israeli identity, we see Israeli Arabs also embracing an Israeli identity that is not the same as Israeli Jewish identity, but the Israeli part of it is just as important to them as it is to Israeli Jews. And so as that has happened, what you see is Israeli Arabs wanting to have a greater stake in Israeli state and society, and not being willing to accept the notion that they're somehow walled off from everyone else. And that has led to positive developments. One of the big positive developments in my mind is the idea that Israeli Arab parties will at some point in the near future be part of a government. And in this past election cycle that has gone on at this point for a little over 2 years, we've actually seen Israeli Arab parties evolve in response to their constituents, where after the first election, what we saw was what we have generally seen, which is Israeli Arab parties represented by the Joint List saying, we're not here to be part of a government, we're effectively a protest vote. And Israeli Jewish parties saying, that's great, we don't want you part of a government. And then, over elections 2, 3, and 4, this position shifted in revolutionary ways in a very short amount of time, where you saw the Joint List be willing to recommend a candidate for prime minister, which they did twice. Only the second and third times that's ever happened. And you saw them put out a list of things that they wanted to see in order to join a government. And then after the fourth election, I'd say prior to the fourth election, we saw Ra'am, which was one of the 4 Joint List parties, split away and run on its own. And Ra'am is an Islamist party. So in some ways, the party you'd expect to be least involved in Israeli politics and society. And Ra'am, led by Mansour Abbas, said, we are willing to form a government with anybody, either side, on the right or on the left, as long as we can get greater budgets to Arab municipalities, as long as we can get greater police in Arab cities and towns. And so saying, we want to be part of this. And Israeli Jewish parties actively courting Ra'am on both sides. Prime Minister Netanyahu was courting Ra'am, and Yair Lapid was courting Ra'am. And so, you have this push for greater integration, and I think it causes a lot of expectations on the part of Israeli Arabs. And so, on the one hand, they see this push for integration. On the other hand, things like the nation-state law that passed in 2018, they saw as a real setback, and it's something that they saw as an escalation against their greater integration. And then when fighting broke out, Ra'am, which had been in active negotiations to form a government, Ra'am under Mansour Abbas said, we still want to join a government, but we don't think it can happen as fighting is going on. And Naftali Bennett, who had been one of the parties actively negotiating to have Ra'am in a coalition, said, you know what, I'm not sure I'm comfortable with this anymore, and I don't think that I can negotiate to form a government that will include the support of an Arab party. And so all of this is kind of, percolating and bubbling up. And what you have when fighting then takes place between Israel and Hamas, on top of all these other things, was these really terrible scenes of Israeli Arab mobs in these mixed cities, starting off by burning synagogues, torching cars, attacks on Israeli Jews. You quickly then saw Israeli Jews, again, in this sort of same 20-year-old demographic, forming their own groups and carrying out reprisal attacks on Israeli Arabs. And for a period of about a week in some cities, in Lod in particular, but it wasn't only in Lod, it was in Lod and Ramla and Akko and in Jaffa, and to a more limited extent in Haifa. You have these really terrible scenes fighting between the two groups, really ethnic mobs back and forth. And as I said up top, thankfully that is now under control. But I think that on both sides there is now a real sense of distrust that maybe didn't exist a month ago. And I think that everybody's going to have to work really hard to reestablish trust between the two sides, particularly in mixed cities, to make sure that things don't spiral out of control.
Thank you. So you actually opened the door. You talked for a couple of minutes about what's going on in the non-Israeli Arab political arena and the Israeli Arab political arena. Can you take maybe just a minute or two to talk about, because clearly we're entering potentially a fifth election very soon, and there are certainly some thoughts around how the Jewish Israeli kind of election process, Bibi's role, maybe wanting to hold on to power or not, may have played into some of this as well. Can you touch on that for at least just a minute, and then we can move on to the next subject?
There is this conspiracy theory out there that Prime Minister Netanyahu orchestrated the fighting in order to sabotage any chance for an alternative government being formed. I use the term conspiracy theory because I think that's exactly what it is. I don't think that he orchestrated the fighting in order to stay in power. But it is undoubtedly the case that the fighting did give him a boost at staying in power, because as I alluded to, I guess take a step back, right? We had the fourth election last month in April. And after the fourth election, we saw the deadlock that we've now been accustomed to seeing. Prime Minister Netanyahu received the mandate to form a government first. He had 4 weeks to do so. He was unable to. And at that point, the mandate passed to Yair Lapid. And what Yair Lapid had been trying to do was primarily to convince Naftali Bennett, who was the head of Yamina, a party to Likud's right, to convince Naftali Bennett that once Yair Lapid had the mandate, it was in his interest to negotiate with the anti-Netanyahu bloc, or as they refer to themselves as the pro-change bloc. Now, Naftali Bennett heads Yamina. Yamina only has 7 seats in the current Knesset. Despite that, Yair Lapid had said to Naftali Bennett that Bennett could go first in a prime ministerial rotation. He would get the first chance to be prime minister, obviously unusual for a small party, although if anybody here is a fan of the show on Netflix, Borgen, which is a Danish political show. That scenario, it's a great show. I recommend it. That scenario actually happened in that show. So people might want to watch it to see maybe a preview of what could happen in Israeli politics. But that's neither here nor there. Bennett was negotiating with Lapid in this pro-change bloc, and it looked like I was still more pessimistic than many, because it was a bloc of 7 parties that are, just range, across the ideological spectrum, literally from the most left-wing Israeli Jewish party in Meretz to, what is now the second most right-wing party in Yamina. But it looked like they were maybe going to come to a deal that would have included either the outside support or the actual inclusion of Ra'am, this Islamist party, in the coalition. When the fighting started, that all fell apart. Now, in the past couple of days, we have seen reports back and forth that perhaps those parties are now negotiating again. It's unclear. The parties that would have been part of that government that are not Yamina are all still talking to each other, and there's some talk that they're going to sign their own agreements in the next day or two. But Yair Lapid's mandate to form a government expires a week from tomorrow, and there's certainly an open question as to whether Bennett is willing to engage with them again as he was before. I think there's a question whether, if he does, whether the same deal is actually open to him, after he announced that he was no longer willing to form this type of government, whether Lapid is willing to go back and hold the same deal open, and whether they, even if they're both willing to do it, whether 8 days is enough time to get something concluded. Now, if nothing happens before next Tuesday, at that point, one of 2 things happens. Either President Rivlin can give the mandate to form a government to the Knesset, and then any member of Knesset during a 2-week period who can get 61 or more MKs to agree can form a government. that is something that's never, the mandate has never been returned to the Knesset before in the history of Israeli politics. Of course, we're now in a situation where many things that have never happened before have happened. So, that I don't think that would surprise anyone. The more likely scenario, though, is that if Lapid can't form a government, that Rivlin says, okay, that's it, and Israel goes to a fifth election, which would happen in August. There are all sorts of shenanigans going on in the meantime, where Prime Minister Netanyahu is trying to come up with a way for the Knesset to pass a law that would provide for direct election of the Prime Minister, something that Israel did 3 times back in the late 90s and early 2000s. It's probably not going to happen for a variety of reasons. There's also a lot of talk about the Knesset in the interim passing a law that would limit a prime minister to 8 years, term limits, which is something Israel does not have, and that would also make it illegal for, I shouldn't say illegal, would prevent a prime minister who's under indictment from forming a government, something also that Israel currently does not have. Neither of those is likely to pass either. A lot of this, I think, is posturing to try to put pressure on Bennett to agree to a deal, particularly given that the current polling shows if a fifth election is held, Yamina would plummet from its current 7 seats down to 4. So that's probably, I think all of this is probably designed to put some pressure on Bennett to come back to the table and form a government. But this is where things stand, and if I were a betting man, I would put money on a fifth election.
Okay, so I only have 1 or maybe 2 more questions, and then we're going to go to the group's questions because we did collect some. So talk for a couple of minutes maybe about how was so we've gotten a lot of the context around what's been going on recently. How was this ceasefire achieved?
When Hamas shot the rockets on May 10th at Jerusalem, and then also shot at Tel Aviv to demonstrate that it could put Israelis under fire outside the Gaza periphery. After a couple of days, Hamas went to the Egyptians and said, "All right, we're done. Time for ceasefire talks," because they had sort of proven what they wanted to prove. But Israel was not ready for a number of reasons. As I mentioned before, shooting rockets at Jerusalem was itself considered a provocation, more so than other rounds. Second, Hamas's arsenal, it was pretty clear I think probably the IDF surprise, Hamas's arsenal was greater than people had expected, not in terms of quantity, in terms of quality. The warheads were larger, and Hamas was able to shoot rockets as far north as the Jezreel Valley and as far south as Eilat, which is 200 kilometers, and that is farther than anybody expected. People thought that the top range of Hamas rockets was 160 kilometers. Hamas claims that its actual top range is now is 250 kilometers. They didn't demonstrate that, but even so, 200 kilometers, basically puts almost all of Israel in Hamas range. And so the IDF wanted A, to take care of that situation, but B, to do what it did in 2006 with regard to Hezbollah, where in 2006, at the time, people thought that the war in Lebanon was this great failure, but as it turns out, Israel established real deterrence, so much so that there hasn't been any actual fighting of significance between Israel and Hezbollah in 15 years. And I think what the IDF wanted to do this time was to demonstrate to Hamas that there would be a much larger and harsher price to pay in order to prevent the next round of this. And so Israel wasn't ready, and the United States, under President Biden, gave Israel basically free rein for the first week. Last Monday, for the first time, you had the United States kind of tiptoe around the notion of a ceasefire. And then on Wednesday, for the first time, you had President Biden publicly say that he expected Israel to begin to de-escalate toward a ceasefire. Now, when that happened on Wednesday, I think that the cake was pretty much already baked. Israel does not want to send ground troops into Gaza, neither the political echelon nor the IDF, to actually topple Hamas. Sending ground troops into Gaza would inevitably be as messy and as bloody as things were, at the height of the Second Intifada in the West Bank in 2002. And so that's something that Israel has wanted to avoid, pretty much for over a decade. And so when you want to limit yourself to airstrikes, and Israel was trying to take out the longer range rockets and to take out Hamas's tunnel system in Gaza, at some point you run out of targets. And by the point that the U.S. started publicly calling for a ceasefire, things were winding down, and I'm pretty confident that the United States had been told at that point by Israel that there was only about 24 hours left anyway. And so the U.S. called for a ceasefire, worked with the Egyptians to really implement it. A day later, Israel was ready, and so the Israeli Security Cabinet unanimously voted to implement the ceasefire. The Egyptians announced a few hours later that Hamas agreed as well, but that had already been negotiated before the Israeli Security Cabinet voted, and so you had this ceasefire. And as I said, before, I think that it is likely going to hold for now. The real question is how you prevent the next round from happening, and absent real changes in Israeli policy and Palestinian policy and American policy, I think that we're another round of fighting like this, whether it's in 1 year, 5 years, or 10 years, is almost certainly going to happen.
I promise we're going to stay away from the question of how do we solve this ultimately, because I don't think that you, I, or anyone else is going to be able to actually answer that. I think that let's focus on a little more on how to address what's going on, particularly because this is really being waged in social media. So we've gotten a couple of questions that go with the theme of, can reports from Gaza be trusted as accurate, and where to go to find reliable information about what's going on? Any thoughts or suggestions or places that you go to for that kind of stuff?
The question about reports from Gaza is difficult. So there are obviously lots of reporters who operate from Gaza. It's not kind of shut off to the world. We're not talking about North Korea, right, where we're simply relying on whatever the regime says. But if you're a reporter reporting from a place like Gaza, where Hamas is obviously in control and has no compunction about pressuring or physically harming all sorts of people, including reporters, I think there are always questions about how far reporters can go and what they can actually say. I tend to think and I think that a lot of the evidence bears this out, it's more difficult for Palestinian reporters than it is for, let's say, someone from CNN, because even Hamas is going to be reluctant to really go after well-known international reporters. But I wouldn't be surprised if there is some degree of limiting what you say given the situation, even if for no other reason that if you're an international reporter, you don't want to be expelled from Gaza by Hamas. The other difficulty is that casualty numbers come, from what's often called the Palestinian Health Ministry, but the Palestinian Health Ministry in Gaza is controlled by Hamas, and so it's always difficult to verify absolute casualty numbers, and also, of course, in any casualty numbers, how many are civilian and how many are Hamas or Islamic Jihad fighters. So I think there's always a bit of murkiness in reporting, but the idea that every single report coming out of Gaza is inherently false or should be just distrusted on its face, I don't think that is accurate. In terms of where to turn for reporting, I tend to find that the best information comes from the people who are there, and so we are fortunate to live in an age where we all have access in both Hebrew and English to Israeli journalism. Whether you want to read it in an Israeli newspaper online or whether you want to follow Israeli journalists on Twitter, which is frankly how I get most of my information when this kind of thing happens. There are tons of people to follow. I also tend to read Wafa, which is the Palestinian news agency, because what they are saying, and again, whether you think it's reliable or not, what they're saying tells you something. Whether it's being reported accurately or whether it has some embellishment. So I tend to find that the primary sources here are the best ones, and if you read a wide range of them, you can generally see and come to your own conclusions based on who's reporting what and based on how many people are reporting the same.
Thank you. I think part of the reason that we put this together too was that we were hearing from some parents, high school, college students, about how to get information into their kids' hands, either because their children either were that they felt believing the hype or something that the messages that were coming out that they didn't think were credible, and or being able to put real information out there. And so you've mentioned two things that are less likely to appeal to the younger generation who want videos and TikTok and shorter kinds of pieces. Are there good resources that you know of or think, just right offhand, I know you may not have been prepared for this, to go to places where people might be able to find some of that in a more digestible way for the social media generation?
So, I'd say for the social media generation, the more digestible way would be to follow some of the reporters on the ground on Twitter, because obviously, 280 characters is about as digestible as it gets. But I'll say, when it comes to things like videos on TikTok or social media memes, I think that's part of that itself is part of the problem that we're facing. As hopefully people know on their own, but can understand after 45 minutes of listening to me talk, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is very complicated, right? It doesn't lend itself to sound bites. It doesn't lend itself to easily digestible pieces of information without the background context. Without the background context on either side, you're going to end up actually understanding less rather than understanding more. And so, I think that a lot of times there's this temptation, where people are looking to social media influencers or organizations that are dedicated to putting out kind of slogans or talking points, whether they are pro-Israel talking points or whether they are anti-Israel talking points. I tend to find none of this helpful. I think that, I understand why people don't want to sit down and read a 500-page tome on the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict before engaging, and you shouldn't have to. But I also think that if you're looking to understand what's going on based on a 90-second video, then you're never going to actually understand what's going on, and you're going to end up spending most of your time engaging in social media fights back and forth with people on the other side. And there may be value to that, but it certainly isn't going to leave you better educated or better informed or able to have a more productive, fruitful conversation, even with people with whom you disagree. So, I would say that people should spend hopefully a little more time just absorbing some of the facts about what's going on, rather than looking to short, digestible things or memes that maybe make you feel better about your position, but won't necessarily give you any evidence that your position is really the correct one.
Thanks. We had a question that has to do with if there's a way, it sounds like particularly in the territories, and to bypass the official channels politics and find some kind of a partner, a reasonable partner, I think is the way that this person would put it, amongst the Palestinian people in order to have discussions and conversations about moving things forward. Is that a possibility? Does that exist?
Is just so I understand the question, meaning on the government side, or
it sounds like the idea of bypassing the politicians, right? Politicians, and communicate directly to the people, a more grassroots and kind of open conversation, in order to not just listen to the establishment, which may be corrupt or have an agenda, but trying to appeal that way.
Got it. So certainly there are lots of grassroots Palestinian organizations that are working on dialogue, that work on peace building. I'm always loath to name check other organizations, whether positively or negatively. But I'll just mention a few anyway, in case people are looking. There are grassroots peace building organizations such as Sikui or Zimam, that are engaged in dialogue with Israeli counterparts, trying to work on peace building and trying to do a better job of understanding the other side. There are American organizations that work hard on this. Encounter is one of them that brings American Jewish leaders to the West Bank, not to dialogue with Palestinians, but to just hear the Palestinian perspective, to understand better what they're thinking. So there are certainly, ALMEP, Alliance for Middle East Peace, which is another organization that's an umbrella group for over 100 Israeli and Palestinian peace building and grassroots organizations, that work on this issue from various sides. So there are certainly ways to engage with and talk with ordinary Palestinians. It requires kind of putting in effort on our parts as well, right? But there are certainly ways to do this, and there are lots of groups on the ground doing good work. And I'd say that even a great way to sort of understand where Palestinians are, without having to get involved in another group or even leave the comfort of your own house, would be if you look at just some of the polling that's done of Palestinians. Khalil Shikaki, who's probably the most respected Palestinian pollster and political analyst, runs an organization called the Palestinian Center for Survey and Policy Research, or it's Policy and Survey Research. I never remember which one comes first. But he's been doing polls of Israelis and Palestinians in conjunction with Tel Aviv University now for over a quarter century. And he puts out a poll, quarterly polls every 3 months, with very detailed questions about to Palestinians about what they're thinking about politics, about society, about Israel, about the peace process. And it's a really good way of just getting a handle on what ordinary Palestinians are thinking. Not necessarily what you hear coming from the Palestinian Authority or from Hamas, but what Palestinian society is thinking, what their concerns are, where they're headed, and just kind of looking and listening to what Palestinians themselves are saying, is a good way to cut out the top level of government, and see where Palestinians are moving.
I think that it brings up, you're touching on something that another person had asked about, which is there any real opposition? And we were talking about grassroots, but is there opposition in Gaza against, against Hamas? Is there anybody, are there groups that stand up and have a different opinion?
So of course there are. The polling of Palestinians on politics is difficult to begin with, particularly in Gaza, as you might imagine. But before President Abbas postponed indefinitely the elections, and before Fatah split into 3 different groups, the polling indicated that there was a good chance that if elections were held in the West Bank and Gaza, Hamas would win in the West Bank and Fatah would win in Gaza. The reason being that Palestinians living in Gaza don't enjoy living under what is a brutal, authoritarian, fundamentalist, terrorist regime. I don't think very many people would enjoy living under that type of government. And so, among Palestinians in Gaza, they are not happy with Hamas rule. There's a talking point you often see about people in Gaza. They sort of deserve whatever comes to them because they elected Hamas. Well, I think it's important to remember that the Palestinian legislative elections were 2006. Then too, Fatah fractured before the elections, which is why Hamas ended up being the leading vote getter. But the Palestinians living in Gaza didn't vote for Hamas to control Gaza. Hamas took over Gaza, in a violent coup in 2007, and now people there are stuck with them. So does that mean that there is no support for Hamas in Gaza? No, of course there's support for Hamas in Gaza, because there are some people who are attracted to Hamas's more violent program of armed struggle against Israel. There are people who may be more religious and are attracted to Hamas's Islamist ideology. There are people who may just look at Hamas as their best chance of getting one day a Palestinian state through armed struggle. But many Palestinians who live in Gaza do not want to live under Hamas rule. They have no way of really expressing that, because again, Hamas is a brutal authoritarian terrorist regime, and overthrowing that type of regime is very difficult. All the more so when you live in a place that is blockaded. So even if you wanted outside help, it would be tough. So I don't think it's fair to assume that Gazan Palestinians are happy with the situation or support the entity that rules over them. I think that if they had a chance to freely and fairly express their opposition, we would almost certainly see a clear majority of them expressing that opposition.
Thanks. All right, one last question, and then we're going to have to wrap up for today. If there is anything you think that we, as Jews in North America, can do about the situation, either for ourselves or to assist in what's going on, any thoughts or suggestions about what we might be able to do in order to help progress things in some way?
So first and foremost, I would say, and this relates back to a question from before. First and foremost, I would say educate yourself about what's going on without the filters. We do live in literally an unprecedented time where, as I said before, you can read almost every single Israeli daily newspaper online in Hebrew or English. You can watch Israeli news or listen to Israeli radio, online, and sometimes even through your own cable package. The amount of information that we are able to get today firsthand and see and read and listen to the same things that Israelis are listening to and seeing and reading, we can do on our own. And I would encourage everybody to do that as much as possible. Second, it's really important for us to both express our support for Israel, our support for Zionism, our support for Israel as a Jewish state, but to also express to our Israeli friends when we think that something is going wrong. And I think too often American Jews fall into the black and white trap of thinking that if you support Israel and if you express strong support for Israel, that somehow that will be weakened if we acknowledge any Israeli faults. And on the other side, people who only want to focus on Israel's faults and think that that whatever faults Israel has and whatever missteps it makes somehow make Zionism and Israel and having a Jewish state illegitimate. And we should all reject that trap. This should not be a dichotomy, and it's a false choice. We can do these things at once to whatever extent we want to do them. You can support Israel wholeheartedly with every fiber of your being, and you can still acknowledge that perhaps there are things that Israel does that we would like to see them not do, that are not right. And on the other side, you can lead it with your chin and criticize Israel and you can also acknowledge that does not in any way make Israel less legitimate, and that Israelis have every right to a state of their own as any other group does, and that Jews have a right to see Jewish nationalism and self-determination fulfilled. And I hope that if we resist those impulses on the extremes, that we can demonstrate as a community our support for Israel, and also that we have our own opinions about what goes on there, and that it's perfectly fine to voice them.
So that is really great. So first of all, I want to thank everyone who participated. We are going to get the recording and many of the links to things that Michael will have to make sure that we've got your reference material kind of links. We'll get those out to people. I want to acknowledge that there were a lot more questions. Some of them were similar to others. Some of them were really detailed and didn't feel like this was the right place to address all of them. But I really want to thank you, Michael, for those great insights and a little bit of perspective. And let me again thank Eric joining us today on this. As a partnership, we work together on behalf for and with Israel. And it's great that we are able to come together at a time, normally we join together while we're there in order to celebrate and be together. This is a time where it's not so easy to do that. And so that's what a partnership is about, being there in the good and the bad times. I'll wrap up by saying this is a time when we as Jews must stand up and support the continued existence of Israel, as Michael said, and the hope of peaceful coexistence in this region. We hope that this webinar has given all of you additional tools to do just that. And we will send out additional resources that were talked about in this recording. And I look forward to the day very soon when our communities of Atlanta and St. Louis will be able to join together and visit the shared region that we have to see one another again in person. In the meantime, please stay safe. We're in unprecedented times even before this particular situation with the coronavirus virus. So please stay safe, take care of your families, and I'll look forward to meeting all of you in person at some point one day soon. Thank you again, Michael, for all of your insight and help.
Thanks so much for having me.
Take care, everybody. Thank you.